So we're going to cover 2 Kings and 1st and 2nd Chronicles. We'll spend a little bit of time 1st and 2nd Chronicles, not too exhaustive, just to give an overview of the two books since they're both complementary. We spend a little more time on other complementary books just because of the nature of how they fit in, especially with the first 5 books of the Old Testament with the Torah. So we'll cover them enough. And so I have your two outlines, 1st and 2nd Chronicles, and I believe that I gave out 1st and 2nd Kings last time in intro. And I just combined the intro for 1st and 2nd Chronicles together, so you should have a total of 3 pages dealing with those books. The title introduction should be an interesting read. There's some confusion as far as translation, also some of the names that have been given to these books in the past. And so I just highlight some of that for you. Don't get exhaustively into it because there's no need for us to get into great details, but it's enough of a springboard to bounce off of and do other studies if you want to. So what I'm going to do is I had material I was going to cover as far as introduction for 1st and 2nd Chronicles, but decided not to do that. I will cover key elements to the books like I've done with the others, but I won't cover title, introduction, author, and date. So we'll just skip through those since I already give it to you. That will give us more time to cover some of the material. But I want to start back in 2 Kings, and then we'll move into 1st and 2nd Chronicles. But to go back and sort of refresh, since it's been a bit, if we look at starting back at 1 Samuel, again, always wanting to look at the progression of what's happening. It's one of the most important things in studying Scripture is realizing God's progressive revelation, and so following His plan, His message, and so on. We just want to walk and take that journey. So if we walk through 1 Samuel into 2 Samuel, we have this progression that we can see as far as the monarchy. We have the prelude to the monarchy in Israel in the first few chapters of 1 Samuel. Then we have the advent of the monarchy in Israel in chapters 8 through 15, with Saul being the first king. And I would remind you that God's intent was that there would be a theocratic monarchy is what God intended it to be. In other words, the king was going to be the mediator between God and the people and the law and the people. Somewhat like the priests and the judges in the past. But it wasn't meant to be where the king was to displace God completely, and that's really what the people were asking for. Then we have the establishment of the monarchy in Israel with David, and then we have the consolidation of the monarchy in Israel. So this really sets the kingdom in a prime spot as he passes it on to Solomon and the condition of the nation, the kingdom, and that. David had established a great kingdom. He had expanded the boundaries. He had established his city and all of that. His name, Dawid, it's interesting. It's from the word Dawidum, which means leader. And the first time we have traces of this word goes all the way back to the Mari letters that were found in the middle Euphrates. And in the Mari letters, it describes great leadership and administration. And it's really befitting that David was named based off of this name because he was a great leader and administrator. And there were some prime moves that he made as far as his being king and establishing the nation. So David conquered Jerusalem in chapter 5, verses 6 through 15. Then David defeats the Philistines, who were a major burr in the saddle of the nation of Israel for some time. David was going to handle them and deal with them. David then brings the ark to Jerusalem in 6:1 through 23. And David's conquest for Jerusalem, this was an important event. It wasn't just an insignificant thing. It wasn't merely just saying, I prefer Jerusalem over Hebron. There was great wisdom in David doing this, and this is the reason why he conquered the city and he made it his capital, because it was going to become the political and spiritual center for the nation. But there's great wisdom behind him choosing it as being the focal point for this new government that was being established. Again, he is consolidating the nation. There's a sense in which Solomon reigned over a single kingdom, but it was fragmented. Even if we just look at, we talked about before, the relationship between David and Saul and the people and how they viewed the two of them, it was fragmented. But there are other ways in which it was fragmented. Saul never consolidated the nation and bound them together, really. David realizes the strategic importance of Jerusalem. It was going to bring several things. First, the city stood on the border of Judah and Israel. It was going to be that, Switzerland. It was that neutral ground between the two. And so therefore there couldn't be any accusation of favoring one over the other. And really it would alleviate some of the jealousy that would exist between the two northern and southern kingdoms. The other thing was that it was going to be a central point in which there would be commercial and also social interaction was going to take place. It being between the two kingdoms, and it was going to facilitate that there's going to be movement between the city, and everything was going to flow into it when they would move there for the feasts to come the 3 times out of the year for the main festivals, that it was then the hub of worship, but it was also going to be the place, the heartbeat of commerce, that people would come there, gather there, and then things would go out from there, and really Jerusalem then became the hub to the wheel of Israel. But more importantly, it was going to be that focal point in which he was going to uphold loyal worship of Yahweh. And back, God talked about the fact that he was going to have one place in which his name was going to reside. Shiloh was the first place. But now finally David is going to establish that Jerusalem is, and Jerusalem will always be, and that's now the focal point. It's interesting when you come to like Luke's gospel, it's interesting how you see John the Baptist in the first few chapters. His movement is always away from Jerusalem, where Jesus' movement is always towards Jerusalem. And a great turning point in Luke's gospel is 9:51, when it says that Jesus resolutely set his face towards Jerusalem. And then Luke over and over will restate that he is heading towards Jerusalem. He's heading towards Jerusalem. It becomes then a focal point of God's plan and design. So this was not an insignificant thing that David did. It wasn't merely a pure preference thing. It took great wisdom on his part, but also there was spiritual reasons, not just political reasons for why he did what he did. So he shows great mastery as he established the kingdom, and the breadth of his kingdom was pretty extent by the time of his death. And much of his kingdom fit within the boundaries that were established in the covenant in Deuteronomy, and going all the way back to Abraham, as far as the parameters of the land that would belong to Israel. So David, when he then hands his kingdom over to Solomon, it's in a great state. There was sin near the end of David's life, but nonetheless, Solomon was in a great position to take over the kingdom. So we looked at 1 Kings, we looked at the glory of Solomon and United Kingdom, but there was going to be a demise. If we look at Solomon's life, his elaborate building projects and lavish lifestyle then led to the result of forced labor, heavy taxation, other oppressive measures that resulted from this and caused increasing unrest among the people. They were discontent with him as a leader. And then when you look at his religious rebellion in the later years of his life, this also manifested seeds of internal rebellion. And so when it set the stage for what was going to come with his son and the dividing of the kingdom, and we look at the decision that Rehoboam made, but there was steps already in place before that set the stage for the fragmenting of the nation, and also the sin of Solomon is behind all that took place. So we then have the rupture of the kingdom, we have the troubles that come with the two kingdoms, and we have this great divide that exists. And that leads us into 2 Kings, and we looked overall, 2 Kings, we looked at the scope of, we have corruption of the kingdoms, especially Israel, captivity of Israel, corruption of Judah, and then the captivity of Judah. And so again, remind you that chart that I gave you that my professor put together years ago, Dr. Bookman, that man has forgotten more about the Old Testament than I will ever know in my lifetime. But he did that great chart where he, by indication of the arrows, the rises and the falls, all the way through the Old Testament, we just keep seeing this paradigm running through here. Every time that man is faithful to God, centered on God, oriented around God, right? There's great height in the life of the people and the nation. There's great vibrancy, there's life, there's vitality. Then all of a sudden God ceases to be the center, then comes the demise, right? So we just learned the lesson from our predecessors. So this brings us into 2 Kings, and in 2 Kings we'll look at the vision of the kingdom that came in 931 BC. This was at the end of Solomon's reign. We have the northern kingdom, Israel, the southern kingdom, Judah. Judah is going to be preserved a little bit longer than Israel, although they're going to be taken to captivity, but they're going to be preserved because there was a sense of loyalty to God and true worship of God in the southern kingdom a little bit more than in the northern kingdom. But we have the Syrian captivity come in 722 BC, and the Babylonian captivity coming in 3 phases, 605, 597, 586, and then there's going to be 3 phases of restoration that come under Zerubbabel, Ezra, and Nehemiah as we look at the period of the era of restoration. Syrian captivity is very interesting. Sometimes you get the chance to study Assyrian history. Israel's fall comes, 2 Kings chapter 25. This introduces us to the times of the Gentiles, which is mentioned only in Luke's Gospel in 21:24. And then we have Israel's restoration is going to come in Revelation 21 through 6. So again, just sort of putting everything in a big perspective, broad perspective of what God's doing. So 1st and 2nd Kings, if we can contrast the two, 1st Kings begins with a kingdom established in glory. 2nd Kings ends with a kingdom dissolved in shame. 1st Kings begins with a bright prospect for obedience. 2nd Kings ends with the tragic judgments for disobedience. 1st Kings begins with the dazzling splendor of the temple. 2nd Kings ends with the smoke of flame of the temple in ruins. So again, it's interesting to keep in mind, we look at God's progressive revelation. Sometimes it's good to look at these books in comparison and contrast to each other. There's great truth when we start looking at a broader context. The problem oftentimes in the study of Scripture, we'll talk about this on Sunday when I get to Ezra, but so often we narrow the context so much that we're down to a verse, a couple verses, a handful of verses. We have to realize the context is much broader than that. My brother wrote a paper on hermeneutics, and he used as an example was from Edgar Allan Poe's story, The Murder in the Rue Morgue. And it's a fascinating story, but it's really interesting how it highlights some serious hermeneutical principles, but one of them is that the context is a lot broader than we tend to think. So it's always good to look at these collections of writings in comparison in relation to each other and see the journey that they take us on. 2nd King, the purpose for 2nd Kings. 2nd Kings was written to continue the story of divided kingdom and the record of taking captive both the northern and southern kingdoms. The book was written to show that God is faithful to his word and judging his people for their disobedience and idolatry. So we see God's faithfulness not only in his faithfulness in keeping his covenant as far as blessing in that, but he also is faithful in keeping his covenant in regards to disobedience and the judgment that he will pass on if he is disobeyed. The key elements, the key word is captivity for 2nd Kings. Key chapters is chapter 17. This is the captivity of the northern kingdom, and the 25 is the captivity of the southern kingdom. The key verses are chapter 17, verses 7 through 18. And it's interesting because it would seem when you get to, we have a brief summary in chapter 17, verse 6. We'll look at this, but a brief summary of Israel being taken captive and the areas in which they are settled. But then when you get to verse 7, it seems as though the author then puts aside his written resources that he's been using, and he gives his own explanation for the captivity, understanding divinely inspired and guided and so on. So this is, yes, God's evaluation of it, but it would seem that the author then sets aside his written resources that he was using up to this point, and now this is his evaluation, divinely guided and inspired, as he reveals the reason for Israel's fall. And then he'll come back to in verses 24 and following as to what happened to that area, those who were settled in place of the Jews that were there in the northern kingdom. Another key passage or key verses is chapter 23, verses 26 through 27, and then chapter 25, verses 8 through 12. Another unfortunate thing when we read books chapter by chapter as they're broken up for us in the English text is that sometimes we miss the flow of what's happening. And sometimes we miss those distinct breaks between someone recording from existing material and someone giving their own evaluation and so on. So sometimes we miss those things if we're not careful. But key characters: Elisha, Jehu, Jeroboam II, Hezekiah, Josiah, and Manasseh. And we'll touch on all of them just briefly tonight as we walk through the book. We're not going to cover everybody when we come to the northern southern kingdoms. Just take major chunks and look at them instead of covering every specific passage and individual. Never get through 2 Kings. Then the geography is the line of Israel and Judah. And these things are not on your introductory material, although they may be on your outline at the bottom. So starting with 2 Kings chapters 1 through 10, we have the history of Israel, the northern kingdom. And then we're going to look at the history of Israel and Judah, the divided kingdom, chapters 11 through 17, and then the history of Judah, the single kingdom, chapters 18 through 25. We will march through these, and then we will come back and we will look at 1st and 2nd Chronicles. So, history of Israel, the northern kingdom, chapters 1 through 10 of 2 Kings. We have the ministry of Elijah that comes in chapter 1 through chapter 2, verse 11. And it's interesting because the majority of his ministry is found in 1 Kings, and it's in his relationship to Ahab, the evil king Ahab. But most of his ministry is recorded for us in 1 Kings chapter 17 through 19. Part of the reason why he appears here is because there's the transition from him to Elisha. And the major focus is then going to be on Elisha and his ministry that happens. And you'll notice that if you read through their ministries, you'll find that God's miracles through Elisha are almost twice as many as through Elijah. And so he had a very important role, distinct role, but he really desired to carry on the spirit of Elijah in his ministry. And that is why I think he asked for the double portion. It wasn't that he wanted to have a more successful ministry than Elijah, but he wanted to carry on as a successor to his father. And really that connection, we talked about double portion. If you go back to Deuteronomy, right, the oldest son who was to be heir of the fathers was to be given a double portion, therefore to affirm his succession. And so that is really what Elisha is asking for. It's not that he wants a better ministry than Elijah. It wasn't a better than kind of thing. But his desire was to continue on in the spirit of Elijah. So this section, 2 Kings, continues the story of the miraculous ministry and records several things for us. And as far as Elijah's ministry, we have the fire called down from heaven in chapter 1, verses 9 through 12, which is an interesting interaction. Then referring to the king Ahaziah, said when he sent to Elijah a captain with his company of 50 men, the captain went up to Elijah, who was sitting on the top of a hill, and he said to him, "Man of God, the king says, come down." Elijah answered the captain, "If I'm a man of God, then may fire come down from heaven and consume you and your 50 men." Then fire fell from heaven and consumed the captain and his men. At this time the king sent to Elijah another captain with his 50 men. The captain said to a man of God, "This is what the king says, come down at once." Elijah says, "If I am a man of God, may fire come down from heaven and consume you and your 50 men." Then fire of God fell from heaven and consumed him and his 50 men. So the king sent a third captain with his 50 men. This third captain went up, fell on his knees before Elijah. "Man of God," he said, "I begged, please have respect for my life and lives of these 50 men, your servants. See, fire has fallen from heaven and consumed the first 2 captains and their men, but now have respect for my life." Angel Lord said to Elijah, "Go down with him. Do not be afraid of him." So Elijah got up and went down with him to the king. Showing some respect for the man of God. The next thing we have in these chapters is the crossing the Jordan River on dry ground in chapter 2, verse 8. 50 men of the company of the prophets went and stood at a distance facing the place where Elijah and Elisha had stopped at the Jordan. Elijah took his cloak, rolled it up, and struck the water with it. The water divided to the right and to the left, and the 2 men crossed over on dry ground. And the other major incident that happens in this transitional period is in chapter 2, verse 11, his departure into heaven. As they were walking along and talking together, suddenly a chariot of fire, horses of fire appeared and separated the 2 of them. Elijah went up to heaven in a windstorm, and Elisha saw this and cried out, my father, my father." And again, this is why I think he asked for a double portion. That's how he viewed Elijah. I mean, when he was set apart earlier in 1 Kings 19, he was there to serve Elijah, and he served him as a son to a father. Now it was the passing of the mantle, which he cloaked him with in 1 Kings 19. But this is a passing on of ministry, and so that was he's asking for in regards to acknowledgement of succession of Elijah. So then the chariots and the horsemen of Israel, and Elisha saw him no more. And then he took hold of his own clothes and he tore them apart. So that brings us really to the end of Elijah's ministry and introduces Elisha's ministry to us. And he is going to take the scene from then, starting in chapter 2, verse 12. into chapter 8, verse 29. So we have the passing on of Elijah's ministry to Elisha, who is going to face difficult times, a spiritual moral decay in Israel. Elisha's ministry was greatly affected in the people of his day. Several things. First, his influence was significant among the sons of the prophets. This was a group of young men trained to serve the Lord in the northern kingdom. More than likely, they lived together, they studied together, they worshiped together, and they served the Lord together. So we can even go back to 1 Samuel. We see there were groups of prophets that existed besides the ones that were in the forefront. And so when some of these books, we talk about the writing, the authorship and that, there were other prophets besides the ones who have their names on books. There were other spokesmen for God. And that's why God gave the guidelines early on in the Old Testament. We look as to who is a true prophet, who is a false prophet. They had guidelines to measure, to know if this one is true, this one is false, and so on. So they could weigh as to who was and who was not, and it was pretty clear to them who was. The other thing was that Elisha in his ministry, he influenced people through miracles. He worked almost twice as many as Elijah. I think the average is about 11 to 7, if I remember correctly. His influence extended beyond the border of Israel. He was known and respected even in Syria. So even the breadth of his ministry expanded beyond that of Elijah. And he was a great prophet raised up in difficult times. I mean, we start to look at the issues that he had to deal with, the types of kings and so on. There needed to be a man of God, a true man of God, and so God had carried on that succession from Elijah to Elisha. We have the role of Jehu that comes in chapter 9, verse 1 of 2 Kings. And again, I'm jumping broad sections here. We are trying to keep it a survey, and I want to get 1st and 2nd Chronicles covered this evening, so I'm moving a little bit greater pace here. But so starting in chapter 9, verse 1, we have Jehu's going to reign over over Israel. The last recorded act of Elisha was to send one of the sons of the prophets to anoint Jehu, who was captain of the northern army, to be the next king over Israel. Chapter 9, verses 1 through 3. And then Jehu was instructed to destroy all the family of Ahab and to avenge the same prophets of the Lord. And so this was Jehu's role, is that he was going to annihilate the rest of Ahab's family. So with undisguised zeal, and he made this clear even in his own words, how zealous he was to fulfill this task that he was given to annihilate the house of Ahab, and he eradicated Baalism out of Israel, but he was not flawless, nor blameless, nor sinless. He had some problems, but he fulfilled the role that God had set for him to do. In chapter 9, verses 7 through 10, he says, "You are to destroy the house of Ahab, your master, and I will avenge the blood of my servants, the prophets, and the blood of all the Lord's servants shed by Jezebel. The whole house of Ahab will perish. I will cut off from Ahab every last male in Israel, slave or free. I will make the house of Ahab like the house of Jeroboam, son of Nebat, and like the house of Baasha, the son of Ahijah. As for Jezebel, dogs will devour her on the plot of the ground at Jezreel, and no one will bury her. Then he opened the door, and he ran." So this was one of the sons of the prophets. He's making this known to Jehu. In chapter 10, verses 10 through 28, another key passage in dealing with his ministry, it says this, "Know then that not a word the Lord has spoken against the house of Ahab will fail." I love this affirmation, that God's word cannot fail, whether it's in blessing or whether it's in judgment, right? So God's word cannot fail. The Lord has done what he promised through his servant Elijah. So Jehu killed everyone in Jezreel who remained of the house of Ahab, as well as all his chief men, his close friends, his priests, leaving him no survivor. In chapter 10, verse 17, it says this, "When Jehu came to Samaria, he killed all who were left there of Ahab's family. He destroyed them according to the word of the Lord spoken to Elijah. Jehu said, 'Call an assembly in honor of Baal.' So they proclaimed it. Then they sent word throughout Israel, and all the ministers of Baal came. Not one stayed away. They crowded into the temple of Baal until it was full from one end to the other." And so this was a part of Jehu's plot. He was going to bring them all in. I want to sacrifice to Baal. Y'all are going to come and be a part of it, right? But this was all a plot to lure them in, to get them all into one location, and then he's going to destroy them all. So in chapter 10, verse 23, Jehu said to the ministers of Baal, "Look around and see that no servants of the Lord are here with you, only ministers of Baal." So they went in to make sacrifices and burnt offerings. Now Jehu had posted 80 men outside with this warning: "If one of you lets any of the men I am placing in your hands escape, it will be your life for his life." Verse 25 and following says, "As soon as Jehu had finished making the burnt offering, he ordered the guards and officers, 'Go in and kill them, let no one escape.' So they cut them down with the sword. The guards and the officers threw the bodies out and then entered the inner shrine of the temple of Baal. They brought the sacred stone out of the temple of Baal and they burned it. They demolished the sacred stone of Baal. They tore down the temple of Baal, and the people have used it for a latrine to this day." And in verse 28, so Jehu destroyed Baal worship in Israel. So he fulfilled the task that God had for him. Elisha sent one of the sons of the prophets to go and anoint him as king, and his task was to eradicate, to annihilate all of the descendants of Ahab. He was to eradicate Baalism out of the land, and that is what he did. And because of his obedience, the Lord prospered the dynasty of Jehu, causing him to be the longest in the northern kingdom from 841 to 814 BC. Well, because he did continue officially sanction other idolatry introduced in the northern kingdom, the blessing was limited. Chapter 10, verses 29 through 31 records this for us. "However, he did not turn away from the sins of Jeroboam," that's Jeroboam the first, son of Nebat, "which he had caused Israel to commit, the worship of the golden calves at Bethel and Dan." It's amazing, the decision that Jeroboam the first made way back then, right? To divide the kingdom, to make sure that he could solidify his empire and his rule. The only way he knew how to do that was to bring complete division. So he establishes these objects of worship, place of worship, and so on, divide the country to affirm his political stance. And it just had perpetuated from then on, and it continued to go. Verse 30, it says, "And the Lord said to Jehu, because you have done well in accomplishing what is right in my eyes, and have done to the house of Ahab all I have mind to do, your descendants will sit on the throne of Israel to the fourth generation." Yet Jehu was not careful to keep the law of the Lord, the God of Israel, with all his heart. He did not turn away from the sins of Jeroboam, which he had caused Israel to commit. So there was blessing, there was some prosperity, but it was limited because he was still sinful. The history of Israel then and Judah, the divided kingdom, chapters 11 through 17. So Israel, the northern kingdom, all the last 9 kings who ruled Israel before captivity in the north were worshipers of the golden calf. All of them were evil, none of them pleased the Lord. Of the last 9 kings, one does not stand out as, the only one really stands out as Jeroboam the second, and there was some element of his rule, some of the things that he accomplished. And it's interesting because it wasn't that the false worship ceased, but we don't necessarily see it in the text, but historically, Assyria had been brought to a point of power by Tiglath-Pileser I. He was a great ruler and warrior. Tiglath-Pileser III was also one like him, and we find him in the text. But during the time of Jeroboam, Assyria was going to be like a sleeping giant, and Tiglath-Pileser III was going to bring this giant to life again. And all of a sudden, the Assyrian Empire was going to become a major force. But at this time, it was sort of a sleeping giant. So this contributes to some of the influence that Jeroboam had as far as his rule in the line of Jehu. He ruled 41 years, and he brought a degree of prosperity and victory to Israel. And again, this is because Assyria wasn't a major force just yet. They still existed, but again, they were sort of in this lull nationally. He extended the borders of Israel, reclaiming much territory that had been lost for many years. We have this recorded in chapter 14, verse 25. And then Israel also enjoyed material prosperity during his reign, but the man himself was wicked and worshipped the golden calves. And all this is recorded for us in just a few verses in chapter 14 of 2 Kings. Starting in verse 23, "And in the 5th year of Amaziah, the son of Joash, king of Judah, Jeroboam, the son of Joash, king of Israel, became king in Samaria, and he reigned for 41 years. He did evil in the sight of the Lord. He did not depart from all the sins of Jeroboam, the son of Nebat, which he had made Israel sin. He restored the border of Israel from the entrance of Hamath as far as the sea of the Arabah, according to the word of the Lord, the God of Israel, which he spoke through his servant Jonah, the son of Amittai, the prophet, who was of Gahaphar. So basically, he had some prosperity in his reign. He was accomplished some things, but again, he was still worshiping the idols that they had established back when Jeroboam the first reigned. The years of prosperity went quickly, and the inevitable came in 722 BC in the reign of Hoshea. The Lord brought the Assyrians down on Israel. I'll take you, if you turn to chapter 15, because the fall comes in chapter 17. Hoshea is reigning over Israel, beginning of chapter 17. Verse 6, we've already looked at this. There's just a summation of the capturing of the northern kingdom and them taking off. But I want to talk about the Assyrian a little bit in just a moment. But for 2 centuries, God tolerated the wickedness and idolatry, and then finally he had to respond to it because they weren't responding to the prophets, so his judgment came. The northern kingdom was destroyed. Many were killed, many taken captive to Assyria. The Lord was amazingly patient. He had to judge sin. He couldn't let it go. And so in chapter 17, verses 5 through 12, we have God's judgment on the northern kingdom. It's amazing how patient God is, but nonetheless, he still is going to have to deal with the sin of man. So he does this by using the Assyrians. So Shalmaneser V succeeded his father, Tiglath-Pileser III. He reigned from 745 to 727. Now Shalmaneser was king of Assyria. He reigned from 727 to 722 BC. Now, Tiglath-Pileser, he is mentioned actually in chapter 15. If you look with me in verse 17 and following, in the 39th year of Azariah, king of Judah, Menahem, son of Gadi, became king over Israel, and he reigned 10 years in Samaria. He did evil in the sight of the Lord, and he did not depart all his days from the sins of Jeroboam, the son of Nebat. Now notice with me verse 19. Pul, king of Assyria. Pul is Tiglath-Pileser III. He was known to the Babylonians as Pulu. That was his original name. Tiglath-Pileser was a title, an Assyrian title. He took it off from his predecessor. Tiglath-Pileser, or Pulu, or Pul, he was a great warrior, and he was also a great statesman. And he took this moribund, this sort of dead Assyrian empire, and brought it back to life again. Tiglath-Pileser I was the first one to bring the Assyrian empire to an apex, to a great height. Tiglath-Pileser III was going to do this again, and so he takes on this title for himself, but he is really Pulu, or Pul, known to the nation of Israel. But this is who he is. But it is his son who's going to take after him, Shalmaneser V, who is going to take part in the captivity of the northern kingdom. So during the siege of Samaria, when the Assyrians began the destruction and captivity of the northern kingdom, Shalmaneser V died and was succeeded by Sargon II. He is the one who completed the captivity of the northern kingdom and finished the destruction of the northern kingdom, and he is the one who resettled it. So we don't have a mention of his name in the text, but that is what happened. There's a transition that happens between these two in the midst of the sieging of the city. And the sieging of the cities didn't come instantaneously. Notice with me chapter 17, verse 5. Then the king of Assyria invaded the whole land, and he went up to Samaria, and he besieged it 3 years. So it took 3 years for them to take complete custody of the city, to bring it to ruins, and then to ship the nation of Israel out, or the Israelites out of the northern kingdom, and to bring in others to resettle the land. And not everyone was taken out of the northern kingdom. There were some who were left. Typically what they would do is when you'd have an invading people come in and they would conquer a territory, they would remove all the brightest, the strongest, the best, the most wealthy, right, the most affluent. They would take all of them out, and what would be left would be the dregs of what they considered to be of those people. And then they would bring others and resettle the land. That is why when we have with the Samaritans, the Jews didn't like the Samaritans. They were a mixed breed. There were Jews that were still left there, but they intermingled with the others that came and settled in that land, or who the Assyrians brought to settle in that land. They intermingled and they created a mixed race. There's also a mixed religion, because we see this in chapter 17, the invasion of lions that started killing people. And so the suggestion was that these people don't understand the God of this land. They don't know how to worship him. So then, then Sargon II brings in a priest and brings them back to settle back in this region to teach them how to worship Yahweh. But more than likely, he was influenced by the worship of the golden calves and so on, and intermingled that. And so there was this syncretism, if you read on in chapter 17 of 2 Kings, the syncretism that existed. And many of the people that came and were settled in that area did not let go of their traditions, and they did not let go of the things that they have known. So verse 34 of chapter 17, it says, to this day they do according to the earlier customs. They do not fear the Lord, do not follow his statutes. So there was some understanding in the region of Samaria, the worship of Yahweh, but it was intermingled with all this other stuff. And that is why the Jews despised that area. That's why they would walk around it. They would never walk through it. And if there was a Samaritan on the side of the road, they would not help him. And that's why the painting parable that Jesus tells of the Good Samaritan, I mean, what a blow, right, to the religious leaders as he used them as an example, those who passed by the stranger, and yet the Samaritan was held up as the hero of the story. It was such a biting parable that Jesus told. So all of this scene was set now, you know. So we miss some of that stuff in the New Testament. We don't understand what happened in the Old Testament, all the stuff that took place, and sets the stage for what is to happen. But that is what they did. So the capture of Samaria ended the northern kingdom. According to the Assyrian records, they deported 27,290 inhabitants of Israel to foreign locations. And we're given the record of the locations in chapter 17 of 2 Kings, verse 6. Israelites were resettled in the upper Tigris-Euphrates Valley, never returned to the promised land, although there were some who were still left there. But again, they were considered to be the dregs of the society, non-important, and so the Syrians weren't worrying about them raising up and coming back to take revenge. You have Halah, which is mentioned. This was a city northeast of Nineveh. Then you have Habor. This river was northern tributary of the Euphrates, and then the cities of the Medes were northeast of Nineveh. And Samaria was resettled with foreigners, and God did what he had promised in Deuteronomy 28. The Jews were carried off far east to Susa, where the book of Esther then was going to take place. But God, again, is faithful to his word. He's not only faithful to bless, but he's also faithful when he says, I'm going to punish, right? I'm going to punish. This is, to me, it's something I think on often in parenting. Is we set down rules and guidelines for our kids. And sometimes, I'll say sometimes, but probably more than just sometimes we set down rules that are just spontaneous. We're reacting to something. Something happens, it gets on our last nerve or something, right? So we lay down this, I don't want you doing, you know. So we set this rule or whatever. But I'm always asking myself, okay, if I'm going to set down a rule and I'm going to say, this is a rule of this household, this is how it's going to function, am I going to back it up? Right? The problem is, if we start setting down all these rules and then we don't follow up and back them up, they're empty and hollow. And then our kids start thinking, oh, they're not going to do anything. They're not going to do anything. They don't care. They say that, but they're really going to do anything, right? The thing about God is he really does something. He's faithful to his blessings, but he's also faithful in regards to the judgment that he promises he'll bring for disobedience. He's patient. He gives them time. And we look at year spans, he gives them a lot of time, right? That's one of the other things I've learned from God in the Old Testament is I give my children time to grow and know the rules and learn the rules, right? But there is time for discipline. And if I set rules for the house, I better be willing to back them up. Otherwise, I say, give me a thumbs up. Otherwise, they're just empty threats, right? And they mean nothing. So there's a lot to learn from God as he deals with his people. And we have Judah, the southern kingdom. During the last years, the northern kingdom, the southern kingdom experienced the wrath of the wicked ruler Queen Athaliah and the blessings of the righteous ruler Jotham. We find these in chapters 11 and chapters 15. In contrast, the north-south did not had those who were obedient to the Lord, and so therefore there is a period of waiting as far as their punishment. Their punishment is eventually going to come, but they had some righteous rulers, and so therefore their punishment, their deportation was held off for a while. But we have the history of Judah, the single kingdom, chapters 18 through 25. We have the godly king Hezekiah, and this is recorded for us in chapter 18, verse 1 through chapter 20, verse 21. Chapter 19 is an interesting passage in regards to his life, but in 18:5 we have this affirmation from God himself that from all the kings of the south there was none like Hezekiah. So to have God's appraisal upon his life, there must be something about him that was significant. He moved idolatry out of his nation, even destroying the bronze servant of Moses, which became an object of worship. I really believe this is why we don't have the original autographs. And we talk about the New Testament, right? The original writings of the apostles and others. We'd worship them. We wouldn't read them and live them. We would put them in a glass case and put them in a museum, and we'd go bow down to them, right? And God understands this fact. So he destroyed the bronze serpent. Moses, Hezekiah, he obeyed God. He trusted God. He served God. His greatest test came when the powerful Syrian army besieged Jerusalem, demanding its surrender. Hezekiah pled to the Lord for deliverance through the prophet of Isaiah. In chapter 19, verses 5 through 7, we have deliverance that was promised, and it came in an amazing way when God destroyed a large number of the Syrians. In chapter 19, verse 35, we have this recorded for us. It says this, and it happened that night that the angel of the Lord went out, and he struck 185,000 in the camp of the Syrians. And when men arose early in the morning, behold, all of them were dead. We have then the wicked king Manasseh, and that leaves us with an enigma, right? Because we have, here is Hezekiah, one of the most godly kings, right, affirmed by God, and then we have one of the most wicked kings, his son. Manasseh was exactly that, and we find record in chapter 21, verses 10 through 12. So great and pervasive was his influence that God pronounced judgment on Judah. The nation was now doomed for captivity. The evil done by Manasseh became so deeply rooted in Judah that the harvest of wickedness was sure and captivity was sure. It had to happen. He was such an insidious influence upon the people. Which tells you, right, you could be the most godly parent. You can teach your kids all the right things, and you can teach the word, live the word, but there's no guarantee. So it's frustrating sometimes when people quote that proverb, you know, teach a child in the way he should go and he will turn to when he's older. To hold that as a promise is such an abuse, hermeneutically speaking, of Scripture, but so many parents have just been wrecked by that. But people saying that that's a promise rather than a general principle, it's a truism, but it's not a promise that God gives. And so many parents have just beaten themselves up over nothing, really. The last king of Judah, chapter 22, verses 31 through 25:30. Less than a quarter century after Josiah's death, the southern kingdom would disappear from the land. On the world scene, the mighty Assyrian Empire was weakening and was falling steadily before the Babylonian Empire. In the year 605 BC, at the Battle of Carchemish, Babylon defeated the combined forces of Assyria and Egypt, and it emerged as the world power. It's amazing how fast these things can turn, you know. Just watching to see what Putin does. I mean, just divorced his wife after 30 years. But, you know, when we were serving there were movements he was making, and people were talking about the fact that he was going to try and go back to the old way of life, trying to establish his empire. And we see him now on the move. Nebuchadnezzar and his Babylonian army then came down. They subjugated Judah. In the course of the next years, Nebuchadnezzar would come a total of 3 times to Judah. So the first time was in 605 BC. Jehoiakim was king of Judah. Judah became subject nation to Babylon, paying annual taxes. Judah was allowed to have her own king. Some captives and treasure were taken back to Babylon. More likely, this is when Daniel and his buddies were taken. Again, they would normally take the best of the best, the most affluent, rich, the young, those who showed promise, They would take them first. Then you have another movement that happens in 597 BC, when Jehoiakim refused to pay tax. Nebuchadnezzar returned. A new king of the throne, Jehoiakim, submitted to him. The king, the rest of the temple treasure, and some 10,000 captives were taken back to Babylon. And then in 586 BC, we have Zedekiah on the throne of Judah. Once again, Judah withheld its taxes. Nebuchadnezzar returned, destroying the city of Jerusalem, removing the last of the kings of Judah. And this is when they just destroyed everything. So again, we had this progression of Solomon building this beautiful temple that was never going to be reconstructed. Even when they reconstructed in the era of the restoration, was nothing like that. That's why the younger cheering because they didn't know any better, the older crying in the midst of the cheering because they knew better. It was nothing like the future, the past glory days, and the future was still looking somewhat bleak. So that brings us to 1st and 2nd Chronicles. They're the complementary books to 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings. So quickly we'll go through those, not exhaustively. I'm just going to give you a rough overview. If you want some of the notes from them, if you missed them, we go through, let me know and I can make copies for you. But 1st and 2nd Chronicles, and again in the introductory material, I give you the intro to both the books. Instead of splitting up, handle both of them together. And this aspect of the introductory stuff I leave out because I already give it to you in the handout. So we'll skip past the title, the author, and date. Again, it's interesting if you go back and read through the section on the title for the books. It's interesting how the different names come about, the misunderstandings. We've already seen that before. And one of the titles of the books of the Old Testament was based on a mistranslation of a passage. So it's just interesting to see the progression and to know where these names come from, right? Why do we call it what we call it? And should we be calling it something else? But at this stage in the game, probably just leave it as it is, right? I will cover the purpose, though, of 1st and 2nd Chronicles. These books are complementary to 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings. And they were intended to strengthen the remnant of the nation who had made it through the period of Babylonian captivity. They needed to be reminded that the Lord was still with them and that they still had a glorious future because God was faithful to his covenants. Now, from their perspective, it might seem pretty bleak. They come back, there are no walls, there's no temple. They don't have the wealth like before. They're not ruled by their own monarch. They're ruled by someone else. So when they come back, there isn't a whole lot there, but at the same time, they have the affirmation that God is going to be faithful to his covenants. He's restored them to the land, and he is going to be with them. But the nation's apostasy had brought it down, but the nation would rise up again, although it's still going to remain under a foreign power. And that's why we're in the times of the Gentiles still. They're under the boot of oppression still. They are not in their own kingdom, and they don't have their own king on the throne. They're not going to have that till the Messiah returns and establishes his physical kingdom on earth, right? And then they will have their king back. But we will also have ours. Chronicles was written after the Babylonian captivity and was both an encouragement and a warning. It was given to encourage Israel with the truth that God was not through with them, but it was given as a warning that future apostasy or idolatry would again be dealt with severely. God was not going to let sin go unpunished. As patient as he is, right, he has to deal with sin. This is a thing that just reminds me, I was just thinking just recently with someone having a struggle with the issue of the love of God, but it's interesting to me how at times we so compartmentalize God's attributes that we just focus on one. So we can think about the love of God, but we look at an abstraction from all his other attributes, right? His holiness, his justice, righteousness, right? And all of these things. And so that leads us to this distorted view of who God is. This is one of the things I appreciate about 1 John, is it talks about the fact that God is light. But yes, God is love, but it talks about that God is light and God is righteous, but then also God is love. And you cannot just isolate one attribute from all the others. Now, some suggest that the overriding attribute of God is holiness. And again, I say you have problems when you start doing that. but nonetheless, holiness is a crucial attribute that we find of God's, but must be careful. So the outline for First Chronicles, and I'll give you the outline for both the books, and then we'll just come back and just quickly walk through them, but the outline for First Chronicles then is the genealogies, First Chronicles chapters 1 through 9. Then we have the reign of King Saul, First Chronicles chapter 10. And then we have the reign of King David, First Chronicles chapters 11 through 29. And then Second Chronicles, the outline is the United Kingdom under Solomon, Second Chronicles chapters 1 through 9. And then the Southern Kingdom under Judean kings, Second Chronicles chapters 10 through 36. Key elements, key word is temple. There's a difference in perspective, So it's interesting on your handout that I give you as far as the title. I keep referring to it, and I tell you just go and read it, but I'm not going to talk about it now. But in the dealing with the title in your handout that I give you for First and Second Chronicles, there is the true translation. So the title was given the annals, the accounts, the events, or the happenings of the days. And I give you the equivalent meaning today would be the events of the times. The title changed, however, when the books were divided, and at the same time the books were given this name, the things omitted, reflecting material not found in 1st, 2nd Samuel, 1st, 2nd Kings. But that's not really the truth of what Chronicles is about. It's not merely just to give this material that's been omitted from those books. It has a totally different perspective to it. And so we'll talk about the comparison of that with the other books. But the key chapter is 12, David made king of Israel. The key verse, 2 Chronicles 7:14. The key characters are David, Solomon, Asa, Jehoshaphat, and Hezekiah. And then the geography of Chronicles is the land of Israel. If I look at a comparison between the foundational books and then the complementary books, we could see it something like this. We have Samuel and Kings, and then we have Chronicles. From Samuel, Kings viewed both north and south, but Chronicles viewed only the south. Emphasis on the throne in Samuel and Kings, emphasis on the temple in Chronicles. So the perspective is different. The point isn't merely just material that's been omitted from these other records and filling in gaps for us, which in one sense they do that, but that's not the reason why they were written. So it's a misunderstanding of the nature of the Chronicles and why they were given. In Samuel and Kings we have civil and political history. In Chronicles we have sacred history. In Samuel and Kings there's emphasis on the prophet. In Chronicles there's emphasis on the priest. And then in Samuel Kings, wars are prominent. In Chronicles, wars are less prominent. And I would really say that the heart of it sits here, is that the contrast is between the civil and political and the sacred. It's really why Chronicles was given. Its focus is more on that. It's on the temple, the priests, on the Davidic line and the Messiah. In which I think I give you a listing. Yeah, and I think I give you a listing in your introduction of some of the things that the focus is on. But yeah, the land, the nation, Davidic king, the Levitical priest, the temple, and the true worship of God. It's on page 3 of your. So again, helping us to understand the books, it's good to look at them in relation to what's around them. Again, broadening our context. Instead of just a verse, a few verses, a passage, looking at the broader context and help us to put the pieces together of God's narrative that He put together and revealed, and the progression of it and the way that it's connected and the truths that are being communicated. Helps us better in interpretation, helps us better understand how would they view these books and understand them. What was the point for them? Once we understand what the point of these books were for the people of Israel when they returned and the truths that it communicated to them in their historical setting, once we understand that, then we can apply those truths to us. right? Far too often we're really quick to take something we read in Scripture and immediately apply it to our life when we may not necessarily know how it's used there first. And the final one is we have the indictment of the two nations, and then we have the encouragement of the remnant that comes back of the restoration. And that will bring us to Ezra and Nehemiah. But we're not going to go to Ezra and Nehemiah next. We're going to talk about some of the prophets and and some of the poetical works first, and then we'll go to Ezra and Nehemiah. We'll finish off with them in the end. So fear not. The end is not near, but it's nearing. So 1 Chronicles, we have the genealogies, chapters 1 through 9, 1 Chronicles. These lists trace Israel's lineage from Adam to the Babylonian captivity. They reveal the hand of God at work during these years and selected certain ones to fulfill his purposes. This genealogy is important in tracing the line of the Messiah. And again, it's all in the sacredness of it. It wasn't about the political, but the sacred. These genealogies are not exhaustive, but are carefully selected, and it's plain that the author is most interested in the line of David, the tribe of Levi, the tribes of Judah and Benjamin. And we'll see in the return, when they go back, is that there were some priests who were functioning as priests during the captivity who were set aside and not allowed to function like that anymore. Part of the restoration was to get everything right and back in order again, and that had to do even with the priesthood, and that had to do with the true worship of God and how it was supposed to be. There was to be a true restoration, right, to the way things were supposed to be before all of the syncretism and all the mixing in of all of this false stuff, and even moving out the Levitical priests and bringing on one's own priests onto the scene, right, and functioning in those roles. And so all of this stuff was to be dealt with, and so that is what Chronicles is going to focus on. We have the reign of King Saul, chapter 10, and even though Saul reigned for quite some time, very little is given in regards to his rule. We have some revealed to us in 1 Samuel and that, but still there are things that we don't know. We know his unfaithfulness and disobedience received brief treatment in order to contrast him with God's choice of a godly king, King David, but there's still some things that one needed to understand in regards to Saul, and so we have that in chapter 10. We have the reign of King David, chapters 11 through 29. David is a standard used in Scripture for a righteous king. I mean, it's just amazing. Moses and David, right, are really two of those in the Old Testament that are held up as just prime examples. Not just merely as far as their leadership, but their godliness. And yet they were mere men, right? So they were sinners as well, He is seen bringing the nation together and making it into a powerful force for the Lord. And again, we look back early on, the expansion, the boundaries of his kingdom, not merely just the broadening of the city as he established Jerusalem as the hub and the center of the political and spiritual life, but even the boundary of the land as far down as Egypt, that he had influence, power, and control. And this is all within the boundaries of the covenant that was given to Abraham and then developed as we saw it over throughout the progress of the Old Testament. And so what David accomplished was like what no one else has ever accomplished as far as a king. And then he hands it off to Solomon, all right, and there you go. But that's why they're always looking back to David. I mean, that was just like, that was the apex of their national life, was him. Emphasis is placed on David's desire to make Jerusalem the religious capital of the land, and on his desire to build a temple for the Lord. 2 Chronicles, we have the United Kingdom under Solomon, chapters 1 through 9. In 2 Chronicles, the history of Solomon's reign centers on two visions he received. At Gibeon, chapter 1, verses 1 through 13, at Jerusalem, 7:12 through 22. Because of the first vision, Solomon was given unusual wisdom from God, which enabled him to lead God's people. What's interesting is if you look at the interaction between David and Solomon, David acknowledges the fact that Solomon was already a wise man. He had already shown some aptitude of being prudent and wise in his actions and the way that he lived his life, but God was going to give him that divine enablement, that wisdom that was going to astound the world, right? People were going to come from all over to hear from Solomon, right? And even Solomon's wisdom we still use today, and we find it throughout the world, the people still speaking in the Proverbs of Solomon. The second vision took place in the temple itself. God promised blessing and prosperity for obedience, but discipline for disobedience. And eventually that disobedience was going to come, and so therefore the punishment. We have the southern kingdom under the Judean kings, chapters 10 through 36. We have the emphasis in this section is on the godly kings of Judah who ruled after Solomon, the southern kingdom, during both the divided kingdom and the single kingdom. So again, the reason for the delay as far as the captivity was the fact that there were religious, very spiritual, godly kings who were reigning in the southern kingdom, and so therefore the judgment was held off, but the influence of the false worship was still there, and it still made its impact on the people. We have the focuses on Asa in 14:1 through 16:14, Jehoshaphat, which is 17:1 through 20:37, Hezekiah 29:1 through 32:33, and then Josiah 34:1 through 35:27. I mean, that's a great study right there, and just those who are listed. But Josiah, man, come on, you know. Evil kings are given little space by the author. The final chapter describes the final deportation of Judah. And heads up, and I don't think I put this in an introductory material, but you know that 1st and 2nd Chronicles comes at the end of the Jewish canon, and not where we have it, which is very fascinating. It's interesting because you have it there, but you really haven't echoing this connection between Ezra and Chronicles, right? The first few words of Ezra are echoed, right? And so that's why some think that Ezra is the one who had compiled 1st and 2nd Chronicles, but that's just a little piece of information for you. It'll help you in a certain passage in the New Testament to understand the interpretation of it. So we will, although this really brings us up to the period of restoration, Ezra and Nehemiah, we're not going to go into that era or period of restoration yet. We're going to look at some of the prophets and also look at the poetical books. I won't walk through Psalms, Proverbs, and that, but I'll give you introductory material. I might highlight some of them. Just depends, but we will look at some of the prophets, and then I'll have you have background material on all of them for you as well.